Dear viewers, welcome and thank you for your interest, that you are still interested in this really important topic, because now it is necessary to continue to introduce the actors of our immune system. And here again the short look at a film, when we speak of an innate immune system, which is constantly being challenged and polished throughout life, and which activates and stimulates its immune competence with every new infection, then it is this innate immune system. And we count the macrophages, the granulocytes, but also the dendritic cells. And these macrophages, we have taken a bit of the thoughts of an army. These are the soldiers on the front line. They are everywhere there, when it must be recognized immediately and when it must be cleared immediately. That means, these quite large, strong soldiers are well equipped, but not specialized at all. They recognize everything that does not belong in our organism. And in this way they are trained to be very decisive soldiers to be cleared here. That means, they are able to phagocytose, we call it phagocytosis. When something is surrounded for some time or when something is dissolved, it is digested, they eat that and all the cell debris that is created by it, not only by the macrophages themselves, but also by many other immune cells, are cleared from them. But if they are no longer sufficiently responsible for the fact of an infection, by their numerical strength, then they get help. That means, the body is very, very well positioned in its large logistics, and the granulocytes, especially the neutrophilic granulocytes, are actually the kamikaze orchestra. That means, if they attack, then it really gets down to business. And these are kamikaze flyers that are now being targeted very specifically by the preliminary information and attack a massive destruction of these bacteria, viruses, fungi, whatever. They both work quite well together, because the macrophages are the ones that actually phagocytose and clear away these cell debris and pull them out of the traffic. These cells are then really left to the apoptosis, to their own cell death. They make the room free again for new tasks. And I think that's an incredibly great achievement that happens to us every day, because these things are happening every day to all of our mucous membranes. They are happening in our gut and of course also in our blood. That often happens to us when we notice that this state is not taking place unnoticed. But if the burden of the infection is greater than the possibility that is in front of it at the moment, or too strong defense is now required, then the processes that need energy, and you notice that when you are exhausted, also when you are tired, even going to bed at night and sweating a lot means that this defense line is now working and opens up to take its burden on the body. Please do not you see sweating at night as unpleasant and bad, but value it. Look back, what was 2 or 3 days before? Did you have a hard fight? Did you have this fight? Did you have this grief? Did this burden you so heavily at the moment? Then you shut down the signal for immunity. At the moment when you drive it down, the burden can of course increase even more and the body is not able to clarify it immediately for you. This can lead to an outage, that you get sick, viral, bacterial. And these processes mainly take place at night, and also this increase in fever in the evening. Take a look. Or was there a situation where you were very cold? We say viral processes reactivate and then begin after 36-48 hours. A very strong cooling can come up 2 days later from as an infection. And these first defense lines in our body are responsible for this, which are not finished with it. Because if there is a problem that now needs even more defense, then we also have our dendritic cells for this. And I don't even want to say even more, but these dendritic cells, that's actually the command. The soldiers look like a star and they actually patrol the entire tissue. And they can see where the danger is. And even if they don't immediately stop the danger, they are the ones who have a signal or key function between the innate and acquired immune system. Because they now signal to the innate immune system, hey, there's a problem here. And they get the macrophages to clear these abandoned cell debris. Or they detect these particles, these receptors of the viruses, signal to the T lymphocytes and also to the lymph nodes later. Look in the huge library, there was such an infection once. Don't we have antibodies for that? They now detect and immediately turn off this viral reactivation. This is interesting because they also present a competence in our acquired immune system, which can therefore very quickly and very specialized handle an infection. And the more we can collect all this information in our childhood, the more we can build up these high antibodies, the more we can, and that's why he's an adult, resist many infections and is stronger than a child. But a child is not to be considered sick when it has an infection. But it learns to deal with an infection in this infection. And what is best of all, is that the entire immune defense really comes to work. And it needs fever to work. So you don't always immediately lower the fever. All the things you deal with at a later stage, but fever is such a kickoff to get the temperature up, to signal the activity of the acquired immune system and to trigger these maturation processes, which are now taking place, in a very strong force. And that's why the actors here, again summarized, of our innate immune system, these are the neutrophil granulocytes are they called. This is a form of the white blood cells, also like the macrophages, the big ones, the garbage men who clean up everything again, where you can of course also see in the blood. If you make a differential blood sample, then you can judge, do you have a lot of them running right now? Then there are only enough and more, because at the moment there is an infection. Maybe you don't even know where it is playing out right now, because you have a silent inflammation, you have a small inflammation. And you can already assess essential things in advance. And that's also a very good parameter for the course of the process, which you can then read out in the context of a truly chronic, latent, quiet, silent inflammation event. How far this chronically latent inflammation event is dominated again. But as I said, these couriers that work there, like the dendritic cells, of course, there are also several other possibilities. But these are the big ones. I say eating cells or not me, we all say that. They have the job of pulling such things out of the way. That's not all we need from our innate immune system. We also have so-called natural killer cells. And the next slide is just a little look at the natural killer cells. These are units that are in the context of our innate immune system, in the first place to handle viruses and tumor cells. That's why it's very important to know an activity of these natural killer cells. And to know that the special units that we as natural killer cells also judge here in the innate immune system. But inject so-called enzymes that then trigger the cell death in viruses and tumor cells. Natural killer cells mean they are already part of our biology. That we have to go different ways every day, no matter which cells, because they are attacked in their cell metabolism. Because the natural cell death is now taking place and the macrophages recognize and remove it. But where tumor cells tend to multiply, there are enough natural killer cells immediately to dissolve this process immediately and then to remove it. That means, from many different sides, a battlefield is actually being played out in our body every day. Examined from different sides and who has a significant effect on the activity and callability in the body, it always has to be called. That means, not everyone is available with the same number every day. The body forms, the body sends out, the body sends to the place of action. That means, he relies on these priorities himself. But if you, for example, find out about an immune status, the human has far too few natural killer cells. He also has hardly enough vitamin D, then there are connections. That means, with a high vitamin D content, and I was shocked, how people are still sitting in front of me today and vitamin D is super low. So hello, that's the biggest message, that we also control the vitamin D level in October. How much does he need to really? I don't know anyone who has less than 4,000 to 5,000 units and from 5,200 micrograms of vitamin K2 to 5,100 micrograms, who goes into the race to overcome a winter in a good way. "90% of all infections are viral. So if I can't go back to the activity of my natural killer cells now, then the order becomes a bit of a mess. That means, I need that now. And these natural killer cells, of course, also have a very important role in the framework of our immune system and in the defense of tumor cells. And they only take special care of it. That means, every patient must also be looked at in advance, not only his vitamin D level, but also how the immune defense is broadly set up, how much presence the body can regain, how much presence it must also maintain for the daily tasks. But how can I stimulate the activity of natural killer cells? There is a so-called stimulation test today, where I know exactly who is the best stimulator for the activity of natural killer cells. That means recognizing my own weapons in the sense of a healthy defense. And not just seeing the virus for yourself and thinking, you have to go. Or not seeing the tumor alone and saying, you have to go. And bang, I do everything in the meantime, I put everything in a slump. These are actually important things. And again, back to the natural killer cells. Our entire immune system is designed to always get a certain direction of travel. The body doesn't make a mistake. It doesn't do things that it actually wants to attack out of arbitrariness. It is often suggested to it when we see an autoimmune process. But to ask ourselves, what actually led me to no longer be able to use the power of my natural killer cells? Who has weakened them? Why are they not present enough in terms of number? Then I can also understand as a layperson, where does my care have to go? And is it enough that I just know how my vitamin D is or how my cholesterol is or my hemogram, but that I can also do tasks about it within the framework of an immune balance? But we should also be aware that we naturally have an innate immunity, but on the other hand, one that we have to build up first. And we need to build up this immunity, of course, within the framework of our immune system, with a lot of so-called messenger substances. I would like to show you in the next slide that we have the so-called cytokine family here. This is a large family that is actually nothing more than proteins that have a regulative function. Today we know more than 40 or almost 100 so-called messenger substances, cytokines, which are divided into different subgroups. And these cytokines are so-called messenger substances that can retrieve accurate information from the receptors of the immune cells and then simply send their call and their cry for help, more defense, or more care or more willingness to fight, to the other, I would say, fractions of the immune system. These so-called cytokines sometimes don't have a good reputation, because of course we have also fallen back on so-called cytokine storms during Corona, which were almost fatal. These were inflammatory processes that resulted in an aggression that we would no longer have mastered. On the other hand, they are subjected to a very negative assessment, because they have something to do with, for example, if the organ is rejected after an organ transplant. This is always associated with the high activity of the cytokines, because they can react both inflammatory, because inflammation is also needed at the moment. The body can destroy something through inflammation. It's like a fire that it ignites. They can act in a regulatory way by trying to regulate certain processes again, and they can also act inflammatory. That means these cytokines have a great effect on the entire immune system, but much more now, also within the framework of the call of specialized units. The first thing on the right is the so-called interleukins. We have about 40 of the interleukins. Very often we also make a so-called status of the presence of the interleukins and can actually see exactly which ones are directed against inflammation, which defense is driven higher by the body, because it has a chronic inflammation event and what it can mobilize. But what is also pro-inflammatory attacked to give the body the readiness to deal with a bacterial, viral, and whatever stress really adequately. Because what he always wants is that he can do it himself and also manages to do it himself. That means, if I want to treat this bacterial process now, then, for example, the interleukins, which are responsible for driving up the fever, and fever is the starting shot for the signal of defense, but fever is also the process where viruses and bacteria can no longer hold on because they only accept a certain level of lability in the context of temperature. That means, any process above 38.5 degrees, 39, clears up, destroys. That means, interleukins are responsible for this process. And I'm really very surprised how many people actually hardly have a fever or have a high fever. That's why it's so important to assess an immune system, that I have a balanced balance within my interleukin profile, that I naturally adapt to the necessary tasks every day. On the other hand, you can see on this slide below the so-called interferons. Interferons are also the key to defense, especially in viruses and tumor cells. You know that today, in tumor-causing cancer, interferons are used, but also, for example, in liver inflammation, hepatitis, you work with interferons. There are alpha, beta, and gamma interferons, but they interfere a lot with viruses and they are the ones that send out calls for help to signal, "Hello, you killer cells, this is where you have to go." Hello, macrophages, the process has already started. Clear up. The process is well regulated. And then they pull themselves back again, but that's their job. The other thing is the so-called tumor necrosis factor. It sounds a bit bad, but it actually has a big task. It is released by the macrophages, it is produced and it can then remove bacteria, tumor cells, viruses. We can, for example, that is the so-called TNF-alpha, the tumor necrosis factor alpha, we can determine it and at that moment we can test it, how strong, for example, incense reacts, how strongly an enzyme reacts, how strongly curcumin reacts. Now in the activity, here a good anti-inflammatory therapy for the individual patient can be used if he has a chronically inflammatory process in the form of rheumatism or other things. That means these processes are incredibly important and that is why it is also important to know interleukins, to assess them, to know tumor necrosis factors, to assess them and also the status of the interferon. And to assess them in a development event, a disease, also in a laboratory way. The innate and the acquired immune system is ultimately served by two more cell groups. And I would like to mention them for the sake of completeness. These are our B and our T cells, these are also lymphocytes, but these B cells, for example, these are the ones that are the data collectors. That means that the activity of the antibodies is carried out via the B lymphocytes. That means we need these B lymphocytes, and no immune status can be lacking to assess whether we have enough B lymphocytes. Then there must be an incredible concern to drive up these B lymphocytes, because the B lymphocytes are strong, they have grown with us in the number. When we as children are able to have hundreds of thousands of viruses, bacteria, and fungi in us and a lot of strong B lymphocytes with the corresponding antibodies and this maturation to antibodies, which are then ready when I go back into contact with the chickenpox virus or with rubella viruses or whatever. Or now with the C viruses, when the antibodies are there, then that doesn't mean in every case that I just clear the infection. But I have already set up an army that is very targeted with them. That means I can clarify my disease process with it, I can shorten my disease process, and I go back to the so-called B plasma cells or B memory cells. These are now antibodies that the body can form to resist an infection with strong defense. And you all know, we have IgE antibodies that are very strongly increased in bacteria, but not in allergic processes. This shows how the immune system is challenged allergically. We have IgA antibodies that patrol all mucous membranes. These are the gatekeepers. That means I can assess the mucous membrane immunity very well by knowing how my IgA antibodies are doing. This is the IgM, these are antibodies that are very short-lived, and the IgG, the memory cells, these are the ones that keep in memory for a longer period of time when there is a recontact. The T cells are actually the generals. That is number one, and these are the T helper or the T killer cells. The specialization, the superbrain, that is always a degree more sharpened, and they give a lot of answers to questions. And you always have to make a picture of these T cells, because they immediately clarify what I am dealing with here. Do we perhaps have antibodies in the library? Do we have to recruit them now? Just get them out. Are they available? We also have different subtypes. We are talking about Th1, Th2, Th17, and regulatory cells. And if that was all a bit much, it should just explain to you what we don't have to deal with. Who helps us to prepare this daily immune defense, because they will repeat themselves in the next shows. You will understand a lot of clarity about the tasks of these cells, which attack tumor development immediately, dissolve tumor cells, and also viruses. That means everything that changes the activity of these T lymphocytes, which attack, for example, also Epstein-Barr viruses, can be that they are not called at all because I lack sleep, because stress has appeared in my life, because the nutrition is not optimal. This all influences the activity of the T cells, especially the T killer cells, in their task to attack tumors and viruses. And this balance, which then naturally tends to be unstable and can develop an insulin-required diabetes, for example, or a rheumatic event, antibodies that then develop against our own organism are not intended by the organism. And we have influence on the activity of these cells, in which aggressiveness they then act. If we can solve them and we can handle them wonderfully, if we understand at the beginning who attacks our immune system. And so, After these basics, and I thank you very much for your attention, we can then deal with the next questions very quietly and very slowly. What is responsible for the fact that we can no longer return to a healthy defense in our life? In this sense, thank you very much, and I look forward to the next program with you. Goodbye.